Good afternoon and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management Webinar Series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the Program Manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. We would like to extend a special thanks to Bob Hollis of the Mobius Network for providing the webinar management software for this series, and Lisa Ruggiero of the National Recycling Coalition for providing technical support. Today's webinar will provide an update on paper and plastic recycling markets. Our presenters today are Greg Rudder and Mylinda Jacobsen, who will be introduced in a moment. Following the presentations, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you are experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. And now I'd like to introduce our first presenter. Greg Rudder is the lead editor for PPI Pulp and Paper Week. He has covered U.S. and export recovered paper markets for 17 years, containerboard for 9 years, and newsprint for 5 years. Greg is a Pepperdine University graduate, and he was a daily newspaper reporter for 12 years before joining PPI Pulp and Paper Week. He has interviewed 20 CEOs and visited 35 mills and plants globally. And now I'd like to hand it over to Greg.
Great, thank you, Wayne. Good to be here, much appreciated. I'm going to talk about a few things here related to the recovered paper market in North America and really touch globally into the big market in China as well, as it relates to recovered paper exports. So I'm going to talk a little bit real quickly about RISI and PPW, and then move right into the market dynamics that have been at play in basically the last year, and take us through the numbers and the pricing in the last year, and then end with a little bit of a look out into the second quarter. Based on what market players are saying and what they're seeing in the second quarter. Again, I've been with PPW now, believe it or not, it'll be 20 years in October. As Wayne mentioned, a newspaper reporter before that, and I've covered a lot of the paper and board markets as well. So I will touch a little bit on that toward the end. Since how the paper and board markets move have an effect on recovered paper. Recovered paper is changing face 2015. What I'm really referring here to is really the change that's gone on in the last 3 years. We've seen some dramatic changes that have affected the supply and demand of recovered paper, not only globally, but especially in the United States and North America. So I'm gonna touch a little bit upon that. And that shoots, of course, over into the keys as I see them of what's going on in the market today. The last year, we've seen OCC prices for domestic mills in the U.S. drop 30%. There's been a similar decline in the export price out of the United States to the main export market, which is China. Let me back up just a little bit and give some numbers related to the size of the market before moving on the other key points. In 2014, 79 million tons of paper and board was made in the United States. Of that, 35% came from, about 35%, maybe a little bit more, came from recovered paper. The recovered paper share of the paper and board market totals 30 million tons, and that's what's sold to the domestic mills in the U.S. that make paper and board. Along with that 30 million tons, there's also 21 million tons of demand for U.S. recovered paper that comes from the export market. So in total, you have a U.S. market for recovered paper of about 50 to 51 million tons. Quickly, on that 21 million tons that's exported, almost 70% ends up in China. So China is the dominant buyer of U.S. recovered paper. And of course, over the years, has developed U.S. firms that are main suppliers to China, U.S. firms that are headquartered in America. So they've become quite a presence as it relates to the supply, demand, and pricing of recovered paper in the United States. Moving back to the keys, again, the price fall on OCC of 30% over the last year for domestic mills. There are some side factors that have been in play that have affected or caused that to happen. One of them, we've seen the port congestion on the West Coast since October. Keep in mind that about 60% of the 21 million tons of U.S. exports of recovered paper come out of the ports on the West Coast, with the biggest one, of course, being Los Angeles and Long Beach terminals. The second largest in Oakland in Northern California, and the third largest on the West Coast is, of course, SeaTac, Seattle, Tacoma. So again, those three combined export about 60%, maybe a little more, of all U.S. recovered paper exports. So the congestion that's occurred because of the negotiations between the terminal operators and the workers' union has come from the delays in the negotiations. I understand the Labor Secretary, Perez, from the Obama administration, is apparently involved in the talks today. There's concerns about the delays at the ports and how this situation is going to be resolved. It's very unclear. What we've seen happen over the last 3 to 4 months is suppliers in Los Angeles, for example, warehousing tons because they've been unable to export as efficiently as they could before. About 50 to 60%, the ports are operating at about 50 or 60% of capacity, and that impact, of course, affects those that are exporting a material like recovered paper. There's been quite a congestion delay caused, and that's been a factor, of course, on more material in the United States rather than being exported that has affected domestic pricing, especially on OCC. The major impact on the price fall for OCC in the United States in the last year has been China's demand decline. China in the mid-90s started growing its paper and board capacity from roughly 20, 30 million tons of capacity. Today it's about 125 million tons. And to fiber those new machines, part of that had to come from recovered paper. And as a result, China became a huge buyer of U.S. recovered paper. Well, what we've seen in the last 3 years is China's demand decline for U.S. recovered paper to the tune of 1.4 million tons over the last 3 years. So that's been quite a change in the supply-demand balance in the United States. Those tons that would have been going to China and did in 2011, in 2013 and 14, are not, to the tune of 1.4 million tons. So that's had an impact, I believe, on the pricing of OCC as well, because the OCC demand in China is very strong. U.S. OCC demand in China has been very strong from the main containerboard producers there, Nine Dragons Paper and Lee and Man. Two other side points also, but keys in my opinion. One is the paper stock industries next week in Dallas will be having a specifications summit, and there they'll go over the specifications for the grades of recovered paper in the United States. And there's focus on OCC and maybe the addition of, at least that's been what's talked about by market players, the addition of a couple of definitions to OCC. And then ONP also, in terms of how that market has changed in terms of demand and quality, I believe will be a market, a segment in the material that will be looked at very closely as well. So that'll be important, the specifications, because they're used by the traders both domestically and on the export market. in terms of the movement of recovered paper. And then finally, this year, in 2015, there's going to be about 450,000 tons of additional capacity. Almost all of it, about 440,000, will be in containerboard. There are several major projects, and I'll get into them in a few minutes, but they include the Pratt Industries Valparaiso, Indiana, linerboard and medium mill, and also the International Paper restart of a machine in Valiant, Oklahoma. So both of those mills will be fairly heavy OCC buyers. So there's an effect from that as well. And then finally, and I don't have it listed as a key, but I want to list it as well, is the weather situation in the Northeast and the impact that I'm starting to hear is coming into play in terms of the inability to move tons from supplier to buyer. And it's something to watch over the next month or so to see how it affects the pricing of raw materials, impassable roads, issues like that, because of the snow that just ties up supply that otherwise would have been transported to a buyer. So that's another issue to watch moving forward. Talk a little bit about the mill consumption in the United States. Again, this is the 30 million ton segment of the 51 million tons of U.S. recovered paper demand. And as you can see in the last 4 years, U.S. mills they're purchasing 30 million tons a year, and that's not changing. It's not like the demand is jumping up. It's actually holding very, very steady right at 30 million. And that is interesting because in 2013, 1 million tons of containerboard capacity started up in North America, but the mills that were shut as well did not, were an offset that did not lead to mills consuming more recovered paper. So anyway, bottom line, U.S. mill consumption very steady as it relates to the total amount of tons. And we've seen that now over the last 4 years, and it doesn't look like that's going to be changing much, although, as I said, there is some additional capacity coming on, so it's going to be interesting to watch. And then the U.S. market, looking over the last 4 years, has become dramatically driven by OCC. We've seen shutdowns on the printing and writing and newsprint side in the paper grade, and as a result, the demand and the share of the recovered paper by U.S. mills is now 2/3 OCC. Looking at ONP, as you can see, it's dropped in half in the last 4 years, from 4 million tons to basically 2 million consumed. So, and then high-grade de-inking has been interesting, a little bit of growth there. We've seen a bunch of tissue paper mills started up, most of them on the virgin side since late 2010, but a few of them also in recycled content. So that's the reason for the slight increase in the last 4 years in the demand for high grades, from the 8% to the 8.9% of the total 30 million. And here's a big slide. It shows the export fall off from China. Something certainly happened, I think, at the end of 2011 in China. They jumped up to 14.3 million metric tons of U.S. recovered paper, and then they've incrementally dropped their buying in each of the last 3 years, from the 14.3 down to roughly 13 million, 12.9 in 2014. Still, the Chinese share of total exports around 68%, and that gets back to that point that I made earlier about the Chinese impact on pricing in the United States. With such a, being such a big export market, they have quite an impact on the domestic market in the United States as a result. And there's a term called chasing the export price. It's a key one in understanding OCC, in my view. And what it means is that when export demand picks up and picks up strongly, there's a bit of a chase that goes on. The price continues to rise over days and a couple of weeks, maybe $5, $10, maybe $15 over that time. This is what's happened in the past. And it puts into play a situation with a segment of the supply where domestic has to protect its supply or lose it to export. So they're faced with the situation of chasing that price or not. And if they chase, then there typically is an impact on the domestic price. And again, in the last year, with OCC being down 30%, there obviously has not been any chasing by U.S. mills of Chinese export buying. And as a result, when you look back on the numbers in terms of the total tons of recovered paper exported to China in the last 3 years, the numbers have dropped. So it adds up to the situation in the marketplace as it relates to the decline in OCC. I wanted to mention quickly a few other points that I think are critical to the market today and affected U.S. exports to China as well. In 2013, in February, the so-called Green Fence program began in China, and that's where there was intensive checking and inspections of U.S. mixed paper. I should say mixed paper imports, not just from the United States. That affected some U.S. suppliers, especially those with MRF, in terms of the quality that comes out of those MRFs with their mixed paper. So there's an impact there that affected the decline, an impact from Green Fence that affected the decline in the U.S. exports to China, in my view. Also at the same time, in 2011, 2012, we've seen China, as it continued to grow its paper and board capacity, in country, its recovery of recovered paper has increased. And that's expected, I know, by our economist per recovered paper, Hannah Zhao, to continue in the next 2 to 3 years. So bottom line, what that means is if China gets better at recovering more paper in its own country, then its demand for imported recovered paper will decline. And it's done that over the last few years by a couple of % each year. And I know our economist thinks that it will continue in the next couple of years. Not in a big way, but that China's imports will continue to decline a couple of %, 2 or 3 or 4% per year over the next few years. So that's a big issue as it relates to U.S. exporters in terms of how to be placed in the market if the demand from China continues to go down over the next couple of years. And what I've continued to hear over about the last I shouldn't say continued, but what I've heard from some players over the last 6 months, especially those that have become 80 to 90% of their tonnage export players, with the other 10 or 20 going domestic, that they're trying to reevaluate that mix to figure out where they want to be if China, the main export market for U.S. recovered paper, continues to buy a little less from the United States over the next few years. Big issue to watch also, of course, is China's economy. Global manufacturing hub of the world in China. The stimulus funds that were just put out by the government in China last week. We'll see how that affects the economy in terms of its growth in the second quarter and third quarter of 2015. Bottom line, I mean, if China's economy starts to grow at a better pace and where it was, say, 4 or 5 years ago, there's an impact globally on the economies, including the United States, of course. And, of course, that would affect recovered paper. Okay, jump into a big item, pricing. Here's the jump down on OCC. February 2015, $72.50 national average price, down 30%. That matches up with the export decline year over year. The FAS-LA price at $135, down 30% basically as well. I've also added mixed paper in there The quality of ONP in the United States has been on a decline, as well has been the demand for that material. So the pricing for mixed paper and ONP are very close on the export market. They've basically been running the last year or two within $10 of each other. So all I've shown on the domestic price of the $47 FOB seller stock is mixed paper, because ONP, as I said, is very closely priced to mixed paper now. Also, interestingly, while the bulk grade prices have declined in the last year, largely because of the export situation, we've seen office paper, pulp sub, and high grades rise in price, not only for the domestic mills, but of course on export as well. Just an interesting dynamic that you got OCC, the big material, dropping, and you have OP increasing with about an 8% rise for the domestic mills over the last year and an 11% rise on export. And OP has moved on the export market not only to Mexico in a big number, but also to Asia. And then finally, I also, on export FAS, wanted to shoot back to the last peak on OCC pricing FAS, and that was in February, March of 2011. Just to give an example to show that's where the last peak was, which was the 225 FAS LA, and today now down to 135, with all the concerns related to the delays and the port congestion issues and everything there hampering that, affecting that price. Capacity additions. I wanted to mention these because they can affect demand, and if supply doesn't match up, then prices could rise. The 2012, 2013, as you can see, and the 2014, 2015, 11 PMs total added, 2.6 million short tons. Again, these are just those added. There are also mills that have shut down that have or converted out of certain grades of recovered paper as well. So I don't have the minus there, but anyway, just wanted to give you a picture of the additions in capacity. Narampac, Niagara Falls, big mill in upstate New York. SP Fiber Technology in Dublin turned a newsprint mill, both machines, into a board. Wausau, Harrodsburg, buying Dinks Pulp for, as I understand it, for a recycled content tissue machine. And then, of course, the 2014, 2015, Pratt Valparaiso, supposed to be an October startup. That's a big machine. And also IP Valiant, similarly sized. Both of those, I believe, are around 350,000 tons each. So that'll be 350,000 ton machine starting up in May, and then another one of similar size in October. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the supply situations are like at the end of the second quarter and in the middle of or at the beginning of the fourth quarter this year as it relates to OCC. It would in the Midwest as well as the Southwest. So that gives you a little picture of the recycled content capacity additions that are expected this year. And then finally, before a summation, I just wanted to talk a little bit about paper and board pricing. Again, the demand situation and pricing situation there sometimes can have an impact on recovered paper, vice versa sometimes. Kraft liner board pricing up in the last 4 years. I just took January 10 versus January 15. Pre-sheet down, lightweight coated up, and newsprint up. So some higher prices in the paper grades. Pre-sheet did move up on the cut size paper in the last year and has now started to come back down slightly. And of course, pulp has moved up, and I think that's affected pulp subs. In fact, in 2014, 8 out of the 12 months, NBSK in the United States was at its highest run, above 1020 to 1040. Never before that we've seen in our pricing history has there been such a long run at 1,000 plus as there was last year on virgin pulp, NBSK. Key paper and board dynamic and container board, a strong 4Q for box volume. There's been a little bit of talk. Will there be a price increase attempt in 2015 in container board, linerboard, and medium? The last one was a few years ago. New capacity continues to come into to enter the container board market. It'll be about 1.7 million tons total over 2013 to 2015. Two different mergers that I wanted to mention: Rock 10 and Midwest Vaco, and the Kerastar Newark Group merger. The contacts were claiming that would be finished off this week and announced as being final. That makes Kerastar and Newark Group as one a larger player in recovered paper. Rock 10 already is the second largest consumer of recovered paper and a major player in terms of collection of material. And they'll be combining with Midwest Vaco. So just a little bit of insight there on containerboard. Uncoated free sheet, in the middle of that whole issue is a trade case that was just filed last month, where four U.S. producers and the United Steelworkers are seeking duties against 5 countries, including China, Indonesia, and Hong Kong, on cut-size office paper. It's interesting to watch to see how that affects the uncoated free sheet market in the United States. There's been a flood of imports on cut-size office paper into the U.S., and hence that's why the lawsuit was filed last month. 2 price hikes in 2013 and 2014 on uncoated free sheet. Those were the first in 2.5 years. And now the market pricing seems to be settling down slightly. And there is not talk, at least not that I hear, of price increases. Capacity shuts in uncoated free sheet as well. Coated printing and writing coated printing and writing papers. Again, another story there related to consolidation. Verso New Page is combined. Now Catalyst has emerged after buying 2 of the mills that were required to be sold off by Verso New Page, has become the main player in coated mechanical. And Verso New Page, of course, is the largest in coated free sheet in front of Sappi. So some big changes there as it relates to consolidation, and it's worth watching to see what will happen there on the coated paper pricing front. And then in newsprint, there's just been a continual decline in demand, and as a result, conversions into other grades by newsprint producers. In summation, I just wanted to touch upon a couple of final points related to recovered paper pricing. I think the key thing to watch right now is the port situation on the West Coast in terms of, will there be an agreement? Will there be another lockout? The terminal operators closed down the ports for 4 days last week through yesterday. Don't know if the ports how well they're operating today, but that's a huge issue, because if you have 60% of the recovered paper being delayed in terms of export, that means additional tons from that amount will come back into the domestic market, which is a price pressure down. So the port situation and the labor talks, it's a critical issue to keep an eye on going forward related to the market and to pricing. The other, of course, is to watch China and its economy and see how the stimulus money affects the consumer spending there, the demand for packaging, and what happens on the containerboard and boxboard side, and then just generally the overall Chinese economy. And then finally, as I mentioned, the other issue of the Valiant Valparaiso startup and how those will affect the U.S. market. So yeah, appreciate your time. Again, Greg Rudder, you've got my email address as well as my phone number, and I thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you, Greg. Very thorough and detailed update on the paper markets. And now I'd like to introduce our next presenter. Mylinda Jacobsen is the purchasing manager for Envision Plastics and is a business development expert who builds positive global relationships for recycling-focused enterprises and has designed and implemented innovative recycling programs. As an industry thought leader, her peers have selected her to serve on major recycling industry committees. Her additional achievements include growing the supplier base by 110%, leading a company to become number 2 in its sector, and leading planning and execution of a recycling program for 23,000 residents, saving millions by improving both relationships and recycling processes. And now I'd like to introduce Mylinda.
Envision is an HDPE recycler, so a lot of my examples might be heavy in polyethylene, but I'm open to, in the Q&A, to trying to answer some questions on other resins, and I'm certainly going to talk about those. Can you go to the next slide, please, Wayne? So this is how my talk is organized. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current market conditions, global factors on virgin resin, HDPE, and some other grades. And if you market or sell recycled plastics, even post-industrial plastics, you will have undoubtedly noticed that we are in a period of market correction. Much of what is going on in the paper world, similar factors apply to the plastics world. And when I was listening to Greg's talk, just to kind of add an aside here, just today, after all the snow, we saw increases on the high-density market due to weather-related conditions. So I'm going to touch on that in a few minutes, but the port congestion, the weather, they're all influencing what, the market conditions right now. So 2014 was sort of a so-so year for the recycled materials markets. While recycled resin prices have been, I call it porpoising, kind of up and down, the oil price slide at the end of the year certainly affected recycled resin prices. And this was good news for manufacturers who could get cheaper resins, and they could also get cheap virgin resins, which is one of the big drivers right now. Global factors on virgin resins with a lot of supply and lower prices. But they could get virgin materials relatively inexpensively, but sometimes lower prices, as that drove down the recycled prices of resin, sometimes those lower prices can affect things like what we collect at the curb and how it's handled at the MRF, which I'll talk about in a minute. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Wayne. The current market conditions, and I'm going to start with polyethylene. Mixed color HDPE. So one of the conversations I was having right before I got on this call was with a large supplier of recycled colored bales, colored and natural bales. And we were talking about whether the market was starting to rebound. Everybody wants the mixed colored HDPE. Yesterday, I probably would have said 6 more cents are supposed to come out of the recycled polyethylene market before we start to rebound. Right now, with the weather, the congestion at the ports, which is causing some companies to warehouse their bales, supplies starting to get shorter, we may see an artificial rebound. The next slide, please, Wayne. Next slide, there we go. So to talk about the prices, to understand the current dynamics, we need to look at the history. And if you look at these two graphs, which just come right off of recyclingmarkets.net, to understand current dynamics, we need to look at the history. In the fall of 2014, we saw historic high prices on all commodities, not just HDPE. And that they were prices that we had never seen before. I mean, prices that were for the bale that are higher than what pellets are selling for now. The decline started in the second half of November, and it's continuing until now. Polyethylene is kind of interesting. Polyethylene has been one of those bright spots for recyclers. I think has margins started to decline in paper and in metal. This was still a high-priced commodity. Now, with margins decreasing in polyethylene, it'll be interesting to see how it's sort of handled at the MRF. For those of you who are interested, the month started at 25 and 19 for polyethylene, 25 for natural, 19 cents a pound for the colored HDP material. And right now, I think we're probably at 26 and a half and 21 cents. So we're starting to see a little uptick. It's not because I think the markets are recovering. That is, in fact, I think weather-related, as supply is starting to dwindle from all the snows and even the snow we got yesterday. Next slide, please. PET. So PET is kind of interesting. I think it's more heavily tied to oil than polyethylene. Again, no surprise, a downward trend, and there's also, kind of like Greg was saying, capacity issues. There's a lot of PET capacity, a lot of virgin PET capacity. Right now, current market prices are 12 to 12.5 cents, and I think the general idea among recyclers is that more price is going to come out of the PET bale market. So if you're selling PET, you'll probably see softer prices. And it doesn't help that there's a very large PET recycler who's going offline for a couple months. So that's 6 million pounds of capacity that they buy every month that will not be buying, will be kind of out there in the market. So I would expect much, much softer prices. Next week in Dallas, where all the PET and high-density recyclers will be, and now all the paper guys too, I'm sure we'll be talking a whole lot about what the outlook is. And if you go to the next slide, please. I think the HD and PET weather-related situations aside will remain relatively soft through first quarter, but the market is expected to rebound. One of the things we talk about in our office is March. March is the month where we have high demand, and how will that affect prices, especially with weather-related incidents kind of blocking up supply. So we expect the market will rebound, and this is exactly what the CDI forecast said would happen. So CDI is an index that we all sort of look at. It's tied to the virgin markets, but what the CDI said was soft through first quarter and then start to rebound, and we're expecting maybe we might see this in March. So that's the good news on the commodity grades, on the high density and the PET. And then if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about film. So film is one of these, again, just like high density and just like PET, we see high prices in the fall, coming down lower, kind of bottoming out now. A-grade film has good domestic market. That is definitely moving, and it's got a decent price on it too, like in the 20 cents per pound. B-grade still also moving at 13 to 14 cents. And then you have your C-grade film, your colored film, what we would call MRF film. That's kind of low-priced material. Some of that is still moving. There are some markets taking it. On the West Coast, the longshoreman strike is certainly stopping that from being exported. But the good news is I think that all of that will continue to move as well. Polypropylene, also in a period of correction. A lot of the PP, but it's moving, and a lot of that is driven by Walmart, and they're wanting to have more recycled content in their packages, so your yogurt tubs, your apple juice bottles, your iced tea bottles, all those things at the MRF are things of value, and I think the price is actually appropriate in the polypropylene market right now. Next slide, please. So I think good news for commodity grades and some others is that the material is still moving, and we're not seeing the low prices of 2008, and demand remains good overall, and the market will rebound. The strike out on the West Coast, and we have a plant on the West Coast, and believe me, we are really affected by what's going on out there. It's kind of interesting. So there's two dynamics in the country as it pertains to plastic. There is the East Coast and the West Coast. And on the West Coast right now, with the strike at the ports or the slowdown at the ports, we're seeing people start to do more warehousing. So a lot of the prices that we see out there for domestic are, or some people would say, are exporters selling it to East Coast mills who are dying for material. because we can't get anything out of the Northeast, which is where the bulk of our supply goes. So I'll be curious to see what happens over the next couple of weeks and how the commodity grades react with the slowdown on the port and how that affects everything over here with the weather. Next slide, please. So this is about rigids, which is kind of the biggest item that's kind of moving right now in all its different form. There is still a huge, large demand for these low-end type of plastics. And there's a strong demand domestically for it as well. The people are experimenting with these things. And by people, I mean mills. So like a company like Envision is experimenting with bringing rigids in. Another local plastics processor to us a couple miles away has got a whole kind of rigid line that they're getting ready to debut, and all that is pretty exciting. Rigids are sort of lower end materials as well, and it's very good that they have that those indeed are still moving even in these market conditions. And if you advance the next slide, Wayne. We have to move through some of my rigid stuff here. Sorry. Strong demand, that's a takeaway on that. And if you get to the next one, please. So these are all the different kinds of rigids, and these are rigids I have personally seen here at our plant. So they come in all shapes and sizes. And the good news is that there are strong domestic markets for these. Some of the higher end stuff, like you would call your trash cans and things like that, those are sort of I think the mothership of rigids, the high end stuff. That stuff is still moving with decent prices, but so is these kind of mixed rigid plastics, MRP, and it's not going export. A lot of this stuff is staying domestic. It's still moving even in this kind of market condition. The worse quality it is, I think the cheaper prices we're getting. And that kind of takes me into the next slide, if you would advance it, please, Wayne. I want to take a moment, because I wouldn't be a good mill buyer if I didn't talk about quality over all grades. And as I talk to buyers, not just in ethylene, but rigids buyers, PET buyers, propylene buyers, film buyers, in a declining market condition like we're seeing now, quality becomes a huge concern. So if what you're hoping for in a post-consumer bale is 10% quality, I mean, right now it's probably over 20%. And that's coming out of each and every MRF. I don't want to name names, but 20% quality issue is huge. It's huge for a mill to absorb. And some of that is driven by the downward trend in market conditions. People just want to shut that stuff out the door. And if you look at this picture, I circled some of the quality issues in the rigid bales, what we would pick out has a quality problem for recyclers. And these are things that we're seeing even in the commodity grade plastics. So I would say you want to keep your material moving and get top dollar in a declining market, you probably need to, do a little more QC before it comes in, because everything is having problems. We have, I would say out of the 20 or so loads that came into Envision yesterday, 5 had QC problems and 2 are rejected. That's a lot of bad stuff. And if you go to the next slide, please. And that's just more pictures of rigids. And we go to the next one. So again, I'm using rigids as an example, but these could easily be any kind of bale that you would see coming out of the MRF. These are exactly polyethylene buckets. And what we want to do, though, is get the quality better, because whether it's commodity grade or rigids, what's happening is we're downgrading a lot, we're rejecting a lot. All that's going back to the MRF, and all the value in it is getting lost. So I think the takeaway from my presentation would be that commodity grades are moving. I think that we've seen a downward trend. In reality, it's not done pushing down, but I think we're going to see some artificial comeback, especially in the polyethylene market. PET is probably going to stay down a little longer. Quality has become a big concern. Whether it's a declining market or an increasing market, I think we all need to take better care of what we're putting into our bales that we're selling. Some lower end grades have actually stopped moving or are getting paid a penny or less. And I can use my own sales as an example. We make a 1 through 7 here that is a byproduct of our plastic pellets, and I am selling that for 1 penny a pound. And I would think it's like a decent quality. It's 90% PET, but I'm getting 1 penny a pound. So, I think the lower end items, the lower quality items, we might see a slowdown, an even bigger slowdown in moving some of those. And I think that's all I got right now, but I'm open for questions.
All right, thank you, Mylinda. We're now going to field some questions for our presenters. Again, if you have a question, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box. And we already have some questions up, and a lot of them are specific to paper or plastic commodity. But if either one of you feel it would be appropriate, you can also add to it with regard to your particular commodity. Okay. This question is for, excuse me. Okay, here we go. This question is for Greg. Regarding export of fiber, if China is decreasing their demand, what other export outlets will replace this demand? And he poses the example of India.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because what we saw is in the last 3 years, China in each one of those years reduced the amount of total U.S. recovered paper it purchased. And so you would have thought that for all 3 of those years, the total exports would have declined as well. And they did in 2 of the 3, the first 2. But this year, exports actually increased by about 1%. So, yeah, the key second markets, if you will, and second markets isn't a good term. The other key markets other than China are India, Mexico, South Korea. Those are the main ones that we're seeing. We're certainly seeing growth to India. India is an interesting play because it pretty much follows what China does as it relates to the pricing levels, and to some degree, not exactly on demand, because as I said, while China has gone down the last 3 years, India has continued to, incrementally grow. So anyway, yep.
Okay. Okay, this is for both. This is regarding contamination issues caused by mixed waste processing and single-stream MRFs. Linda, you did talk about contamination, but this is particularly regarding the processing end of it. Mm-hmm. So, do you want to start off, Tom?
I think there's a lot of contamination coming out of mixed waste and single stream MRFs, and I see it every day. Just an example. There's a large single stream MRF very close to us that we buy a lot of material from, and I'm reluctant to name names, but we've just had 7 rejections because they're dropping too much paper and film into the plastic. When you look at that, like how much money that is to get back and rework it, I'm wondering how they stay in business. I was talking to another commodity buyer. We were talking about this very MRF, and it's the same thing with that, and it's a paper buyer.
Greg, do you want to add anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, Mylinda, I would just add on real quick, just a couple of details. One is, we've seen O&P today now become about a 70% of the recovered paper that goes into the, for O&P to the newsprint mills in the U.S. Comes out of single stream MRFs. So, there's been quite a transformation there from the days of 10 years ago when we put old newspapers out at the curbside, and that became, what went into the pulp or to make the, recycled content newsprint. So anyway, there's a dirtier O&P is what the market tells me, of course. The green fence issue in China with mixed paper also really, I think, put the, kind of put a punch to the MRFs in the United States to, you better do something to try to clean things up. So to me, it's kind of a simple economic kind of issue. If the supply chain changes, it's got to kind of push it from the people that supply a product, whatever it might be. So I think there's that push going on in recovered paper to some degree. Certainly.
I want to add also, I mean, as much as I agree with you, I think one of the problems that we have in plastic is that bale specifications aren't the same. I mean, Envision makes high-end products. We're sort of a very picky mill. People who are buying the same commodity for the same price can tolerate higher levels of contamination. And I think until there's some standardization, there's an argument to be made for that until there's like standardization among bale specs, I mean, we may not see it corrected in high-density polyethylene anyhow.
Okay. This may have been touched on briefly. How has the port problem affected China raw material inventory? Can we expect a surge in pricing when the ports clear up? Hello, anybody there?
Yeah,
Mylinda, I'll defer to you on.
Okay, I talk about the port like every day because we have a mill in California, and so do I think there will be a price surge? I do, but I don't know if it's all going to be driven by China or not. I think one of the dynamics that we're seeing in California is that people are warehousing material because either it has to go export or that they want that's where the higher price is, and so there's an argument to be made that what did I hear? I actually had heard that it's going to take 3 months, maybe 4, to clear out the backlog at the port. By that time, the markets could be changed, and so I don't know if the higher prices are just because market conditions change, or is it demand driven?
Yeah, I agree with Mylinda on that last point. That's my understanding as well. It would take anywhere from 3 to 4, maybe 4 months, maybe longer to get this backlog worked out. And what are the pricing dynamics going to be during those 3 or 4 months? Boy, that's a hard one to say. I would just glance back on China as one example. What is going to be their demand need, and if it's a little better than usual, then maybe you do see prices go up. If it's not, then I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Okay, this one has questions on the strength of the dollar. How does that relate to the price pressure and trade imbalance?
Yeah, I can just speak on one material that I know where there's been some, because of the strong dollar, the demand, say offshore Europe, especially for pulp subs, has dwindled, and as a result, there's talk of pressure, on pulp subs in the United States. But other than that, I can't speak any more generally across the landscape of what does a strong dollar mean in the markets. Just giving one specific example, though, as it relates to pulp subs, what I've noticed over the last 2 weeks. So.
And I have nothing to add to that one.
Okay. This one basically asks if this statement is true. As energy costs reduce and much of recycled material value is in energy savings versus raw materials, it seems the margin of value diminishes for secondary material. I think we can agree with that.
Mm-hmm. I think so too.
Okay. This one is on foam recycling, Mylinda. A non-profit trade organization has initiated a grant program for increasing recovery of residential foam. Is the post-consumer foam market stable and strong enough to encourage this interest?
I think that there are fantastic domestic markets for film, so yes.
And I guess the next question, this mentions carpet. Can you mention anything about carpet recycling?
That's a little bit beyond my level of expertise.
Okay. We do have a webinar scheduled later on this year on carpet recycling, so just stay tuned for that being advertised. So hopefully we can address that question. Okay, this question is for Greg. Given the decreasing volume of old newspaper, could you see a merge of old newspaper and MP on the PPI paper?
Well, can I see it? Possibly. I mean, what I hear from the market is that there is certainly a group of people that are saying that you can't separate the two much. Is what I continue to hear. Can I see that though? I don't know. I'm a market watcher, so I listen. I talk to a lot of people, listen to a lot of people, and then try to report what looks like is going on in the market. And so, yeah, I mean, it's what I hear from the market is certainly that's a possibility. I think we'll get some better insight on that in Dallas next week as it relates to ONP and where the PSI group and what kind of a committee they're going to set up and what direction they're going to go related to ONP, and if they'll keep ONP kind of in its own silo or if they'll try to do something that's a little different that might include mixed paper. So.
Okay, this one's for Mylinda. They're mentioning you mentioned the CDI index, and they're asking you to explain a little more on the relationship between oil prices, virgin resin prices, pellet prices, and post-consumer bottle prices, and what are the dynamics between all these?
Well, that they're all sort of related. The CDI is we use it as a forecast on where virgin prices are going. For some resins, they're more closely tied to oil. Ethylene is more tied towards the natural gas, but it's all interrelated. When the CDI, when oil slid, virgin was sliding, and then the issue with virgin and as it pertains to recycled is the recycled resin, for lack of a better word, is the inferior, and I'm using air quotes, inferior product. So if you can get the better product at the same price or cheaper than recycled, unless you're mandated to use some recycled content, there's an argument to be made that you're going to get the better product. So when recycled resins have to push down their price, the price at the MRF will push down. Does that make sense? I'm happy to entertain that by phone privately if somebody wants to call me.
Sure. Okay, this question's, I guess, for Mylinda also. Where should MRFs make upgrades to their operations to address contamination?
Well, I personally think that the one thing that can really help more than anything, and this is very, very old school, I think, eyes on the material, look at what you're shipping out before you ship it out. And you'd be surprised at whether it's you'd be surprised how many people ship the wrong commodity, and that happens every day. That's kind of a rookie mistake. But in terms of quality, I think we rely so much on mechanized devices. When you walk into a MRF, and rightfully so, people are pushing all kinds of pounds through, and there's a lot of machines and a lot of optical sorting. And I think it still doesn't replace somebody looking at what you're ultimately producing. Because that, if you have eyes on the material, you can see where you need to correct. I'm reluctant to name names, but a very large MRF in Pennsylvania is going through some extraordinary problems, and I could tell just from years of looking at material that they're having a problem with people where they actually have their manual sort, and come to find out after, I want to say maybe 30 rejections and as many downgrades over the last 4 months. Come to find out, out of 12 sorters they were supposed to have, they were only having 2 coming in. So, I mean, where to upgrade? I think have qualified eyes on material. There are some really great sortation, and I think that's up to each MRF. Is your focus going to be more on, I guess, the paper, glass. Certainly glass can be a big problem, and we see it in the plastic sometimes. I'm sure they see it in the paper. So, I don't even know how to address that either. But I would say adding more people to look, actually QCing your product before you ship it would help in so many cases. It's old school, but okay. I think it's good. It's effective.
You actually answered the next question, Mylinda, on glass. Are you still seeing issues with glass contamination?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. we see it more. I think more so now. One of the things we're seeing is we're seeing glass and metal in the plastic, more metal than ever before, which is kind of interesting. With eddy currents and things like that, I'm surprised.
This question again is for Linda. Does the all plastics message, quote unquote all plastics message coming from MRFs create more contamination given that this message can bring in so many non-conforming plastic materials to the facilities?
Yeah. I think that there needs to be some standardized terminology, and that's one of the things that we're talking about. I mean, all plastics is great, but what about those plastics you can't find a market for? Then it ends up as residue. For me personally, I'd rather see more specific message, going to people, going to the curb, I guess, to recycle things, qualify the material a little more. There's no sense in putting something in a recycle bin if it's just going to end up in the landfill anyhow.
I'm not sure if we can answer this one. Does anyone know about China's inventory right now of raw material?
No, I don't.
Yeah, no, I don't have a sense. Yeah, I mean, other than a few comments, the key one of the keys also, of course, will be what occurs after Chinese New Year.
That's right.
Yeah, so will they come back as they typically have in past years, aggressively? And the impression is I've learned is that there's not really that thinking that they will, but and that they don't need to. So, but anyway, we'll see. But a big part of that would be what their inventory situation is today. And I hear there are some spots where they're a little low, but not that it's necessarily going to lead to any sort of pickup in, major pickup in buying. So.
This another question: has the extended producer responsibility efforts in Europe, Canada, etc., had an effort on recyclable material markets? I'm not sure if you can answer that one.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that one.
Yeah, nor can I.
This one's from Mylinda. Regarding plastics recycling, do you see any viable commercial scale markets available for number 6 plastics?
I'm laughing because I could ask that question like every day. I don't, not right now.
Again, Mylinda, have you found an increase in PLA plastics in your pet bales?
No. In fact, the only place we've ever seen it, I've never actually seen anything in our East Coast plant. I've seen it very little in the West.
Mm-hmm. How do you identify it? I mean, is it a special sort?
I've only seen it because I was sorting bales and saw it.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. That's a great question and answer session, and thank you, Mylinda and Greg, for providing those answers. We're going to close now. Again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll hope you can join us for next month's webinar. Please visit the NRC and the RMC websites for scheduling updates. Thanks again, Greg and Mylinda, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.